The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight we speak to Ottawa native Howie Mooney, bus driver by day, sports fanatic by night. Plus, Nam Kiwanuka discusses a part of Black Canadian history they didn't teach you in school. That's next on The Agenda. Howie Mooney does have a day job that has nothing to do with reporting on football and hockey, podcasting, or writing books. But the day job doesn't float this Ottawa native's boat like sports does. And so we thought we'd get him in here to tell us about a couple of his books, Crazy Days and Wild Nights, and the Consequences of Chance, where he indulges in his passion for all things sports. And with that, we welcome Howie Mooney to TVO. It's great to have you in that chair.
Steve, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with your day job. What is it that you normally do?
I am a bus operator for the Toronto Transit Commission. Today's my 15th anniversary, actually.
I'll put it there. Happy
Thank
anniversary to you.
Thank you.
That's great.
It's been a wild 15 years, starting in 2009 and to today, coming out of a history of management jobs where I had to be in touch with a whole bunch of different things, contingency plans in case people didn't show up or if we didn't meet quotas or anything like that. Now the only person I have to manage is myself.
How tough a job is that?
I think I'm a pretty low maintenance employee.
Well, we'll see. How did you get into the whole sportscasting, sports podcasting, sports reporting, all that stuff?
That was a journey. It started off with a couple of things that I started doing in 1986. They are sports. These are the sports trivia, sports history
Sheldon,
calendars.
what camera should I show these to? Camera 3. Okay, right over here. So that's how far back are we going on this one?
This is 1990. This is 1990. Oh, sorry, this one's 1990. This one's 1991.
Okay.
I started working on them in 86. I took about a year and a half to do the research. I went to Ottawa U. Every time I had a spare time, went through their microfiche because that was the only way you could look at old newspapers at the time.
Canadian sports. Oh, look at this.
I found a fact of from each day.
So every day of the year,
yeah,
you got a sports factoid.
Yep, for Canada.
And you put it in there and you built these calendars.
Yes. Now, this was the easy part. The harder part was shopping them around and trying to get a publisher. And I spent about 8 months doing that. And I remember the night of the '88 U.S. election, my brother was at my house. I was on my typewriter typing up a letter to a company in Ottawa. And I said to my brother, this is the last one I'm doing. I don't care. I've done about 40 of these letters. I've been getting either rejections or nothing. And I said, if I get nothing from this one, I'm forgetting the whole thing. But a week later, I got a letter back from Wyman & Sons in Ottawa. I don't think they're around anymore,
okay.
But they said, we'd like to talk to you about this. And so these were sold across Canada in 1989 for 1990 and 1990 for 1991.
More than 3 decades ago now.
It's very cool when you have your friends say, I was in the Winnipeg airport and I saw your calendar. It was pretty cool.
Well, let's go through, okay, those are the calendars.
But from that, I got invitations to do TV shows in Ottawa. And then from that, I got a hosting job on a sports trivia show on Rogers on Saturday evenings.
What city was this?
In Ottawa.
This is in Ottawa, okay.
So we'd have a phone-in show, and I'd ask trivia questions to people, and they'd call in with their answers, and if they got the answers correct, there'd be certain answers that would get a prize, and so we'd give out prizes for people who got correct answers. From that, I got to cover the Rough Riders for television in Ottawa, and then I got the job doing...
We should say, for the younger people watching, the Rough Riders,
yes.
2 words, was a football team in the CFL before the Renegades and before the Red Blacks.
That's true.
There was the Rough Riders.
That's right, and they were around for decades.
And their greatest quarterback, Howie, was a guy from Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, named Russ Jackson.
Absolutely, as you would know.
Went to the same high school as my dad.
Seriously?
Yes, he did.
Wow. Russ Jackson was a teacher at the high school I went to in Ottawa, Rideau High School. He taught my uncle and was my uncle's trigonometry teacher and my uncle's favorite teacher.
Outstanding. Everything connects, Howie.
It does
Everything
connect.
connects. So you're into the book writing, and let's tell some of the stories from the books.
Sure.
Because we're not that far removed from an incident that happened at the Scotiabank Arena not too long ago, where Ryan Reeves took what ultimately judges decided was a very nasty headshot at Darnell Nurse of the
Yes.
Edmonton Oilers, and Reeves got suspended for 5 games. I set that up to say, for anybody who was disturbed by that hit, that was nothing compared to what happened at the Ottawa Civic Centre in 1969 between 2 guys Ted Green and Wayne Mackey. And I remember this. I was a kid, but I remember it. Go ahead, tell the story.
This was the first of a trilogy of terrible things that happened at the Civic Center in 1969. The NHL teams used OHA barns as their training camp facilities. Boston trained in London. St. Louis Blues trained in Ottawa. The Ottawa fans took the Blues as their team. Boston came into Ottawa on September of 1969, and people think exhibition games are useless and all this stuff, but they perform a very great service to the players that are involved, because the young players want to show that they belong. The older players want to show the young players, I still belong. And so they're meaningful for these players. And Wayne Mackey was a rookie with the Blues. He dumped the puck into Ted Green's zone.
He was a defenseman with the Bruins.
Yes, he was. And back then, you could hit guys from behind into the glass, face first, no problem. Mackey did that to Green. Green took exception to that and gave Mackey a shove, knocked him down. Mackey, while on his knees, speared Green in the groin. Green responded by swinging his stick at Mackey and hitting him in the shoulder, and started to skate away to go and serve his 2 minutes for knocking him down originally. And Mackey swung his stick, probably trying to hit Green in the shoulder, but got him in the temple with the heel of his stick and fractured his skull.
What happened to Green at that moment?
Went into paralysis. He didn't even know it. He was trying to get up, and he's paralyzed on one side. And according to play-by-play people that were at the scene at the time, it was one of the most horrific things they ever saw.
His life was in danger.
His life was in danger. They got him on a stretcher, got him out of there, and it would be crazy for us to think of it today, but they continue to play the game after. And he's on his way to the Civic Hospital screaming that this is Mackey's last game in the NHL. This is Mackey's last game in the NHL.
His brain is expanding at that moment.
Exactly,
and about
yeah.
to explode out of his head.
And they had to perform emergency surgery to relieve that pressure.
4 years later, Wayne Mackey died.
Yeah.
What happened?
Over the course of that time, he became a good player with the Vancouver Canucks, wore number 11 for them, but developed a brain tumor and passed away. That number 11 was never retired by the Canucks, but it was taken out of circulation. It was worn by Mark Messier when he went and played for the Canucks for that brief period, but he's the only guy ever to wear it since.
And what happened to Ted Green after that?
Ted Green lost that year, basically, trying to recuperate. He ended up playing another year with Boston, going to the WHA. He became an assistant coach first with the Edmonton Oilers, and later the head coach. Lasted a couple of years, got them to a Stanley Cup, didn't win, but then he was fired.
Scary, scary moment in hockey history.
Absolutely.
Yeah, terrifying. All right, let's move to football. Looky, looky, here comes Cookie. Who was Cookie Gilchrist?
An amazing, amazing football player. And when I say football player, I don't just mean ball carrier, because he did that excellently, but he also was an all-star at linebacker in 1960 with the Argos.
Again, for the younger people, you have to remember, players back then played offense and defense.
Exactly, and he kicked field goals for them as well.
So special teams as well.
He was an amazing football player, but he was a guy who wore out his welcome everywhere he went. He was with Hamilton for a couple of years, with Saskatchewan for a season, lasted 3 years in Toronto, was waived out of the league. Went to the AFL, played in Buffalo for 3 years, was waived off the team. They waived him, let him go for the $100 waiver price to the Denver Broncos.
And he was an MVP, I think, with the Bills.
He was an all-star every year from 1956.
So what was the problem, Howie?
It's funny that you mentioned this, because yesterday I was chatting online with Upton Bell, whose father, Bert Bell, was the commissioner of the NFL before Pete Rozelle. Upton has seen everything in the NFL. He's performed every duty in football, from basically ball boy up to owner. And Upton said Cookie Gilchrist was an excellent football player, but he wore out his welcome everywhere he went. He got in his own way, and he was a disruptive player.
The Argonauts just won the Grey Cup this year.
Yes.
But there was a time, and we're going to go back now. How many years are we going to go back? 53 years we're going to go back to a day where it rained a lot, and as a result, there was ignominy for a guy named Leon McQuay.
It's sad.
What happened?
It's really sad. Leon McQuay, that's a wonderful story, and it's in the book. It's in the book, Crazy Days and Wild Nights. Leo Cahill took the Argos from, as you said, ignominy to champions, or to one of the best teams in the CFL over a period of about 4 years. Getting Leon McQuay and Joe Theismann and a whole bunch of other players in the same offseason.
Big star American players.
Big star American players. But the way he got Leon McQuay, McQuay was going into his third year in university. He was not yet draftable in the NFL. The New York Giants coveted him. Leo Cahill flew down to Tampa. Before he met with Leon McQuay, though, he went to the bank and said, give me $10,000 cash, please. He met Leon McQuay in his dorm room, threw $10,000 on the bed. Leon said, Coach, you better not put that there. I might be wanting to take it. And Leo said, I want you to take it, and I want you to sign with us and be an Argo. 2 days later, he was an Argo. He was a great player. Had legs like tree trunks, could apparently run a 4.340. Was great for the Argos until he got injured late in the season in a game against Calgary. They met Calgary in the Grey Cup on a torrentially rainy day in Vancouver on Empire Stadium on that tartan turf, which is like this floor here when it's wet, the way it was. It's 14-11 for Calgary. Toronto's driving. They're close to getting at least a field goal, if not a touchdown. They're dying seconds of the game. McQuay tries to get the ball into the center of the hash marks. Season opening, tries to cut, slips, falls, and back then the ground could cause a fumble. He fumbled the ball. Calgary recovered. It was game over for the Argos.
And the ignominy for the Argos continued, because remember, they hadn't won a Grey Cup since the 50s.
Exactly.
And wouldn't for another 10 years or so.
Exactly. And Leo Cahill's greatest quote was, when Leon slipped, I fell.
There we go. And again, in a way, like Wayne Mackey, a premature end to his life. He died at 45.
Yeah, had cancer. He went down to Florida, where he was from, became a mechanic, then became a minister, and passed away.
Back to hockey. There was a goalie who played for both the Ottawa Nationals and the Toronto Toros. This is in the old rival World Hockey Association. And his name was Gilles Greton.
Yes.
I'm going to do a quote from your book about Gilly, because Gilly was, as they called him, Gilly was, he was different.
He was different.
Okay, here we go. Sheldon, let's bring this quote up. Here's Gilles Greton saying, you win the Stanley Cup, but what does it mean? People skate around, they kiss the cup. What does it mean? It means bleep all. In the grand scheme of things, being a good person, treating your wife and kids and other people well means far more than winning the Stanley Cup. He went on to say that his hero, Howie, was the Dalai Lama.
Yeah.
Not Rocket Richard,
No.
which would be quite a thing for a Quebec-born hockey player to say. The Rocket was not his idol, because everybody loved the Rocket. He was a very good goalie, but he didn't like hockey. What's the story with Gilles Greton?
People say goalies are different. And I was a goalie for 40-plus years until I had my hips replaced. But he was different. He was different from different. When he was a kid, his dad wasn't around very much. His dad worked shift work, and Gilles was left to his own devices a lot. He did a lot of thinking. When he would go to bed, he couldn't sleep. So he would play sports all day to try to tire himself out so he could sleep. He'd wake up at 3 in the morning, go sit in the kitchen, and he'd think and think and think. And all these questions would go through his head. Existential questions, not questions like what am I going to do tomorrow? What am I going to eat for lunch tomorrow? It's like, why am I in this body? Why am I here? Why, and he continued to ask those questions for the rest of his life. He was good at playing hockey because that's what he did as a kid. There was an outdoor rink across the street from his house. One of his neighbors would come over. It was Jacques Lemaire, and he would take shots on him. Jacques Lemaire was a junior player at the time when Gilles was a peewee. So Lemaire kept the pucks on the ice. He didn't shoot at his head or anything, thankfully. But, he worked through the ranks, played in Oshawa, of all places, his junior hockey, and the Bruins had his rights. But then he ended up going to the WHA. When they offered a lot more money, played with the Nationals and then the Toros.
Now, he had a routine when he was on the ice. He called it his dead fish routine.
Well,
what was that?
That was when there was a lot of pressure in their own end, and he felt his teammates needed a little bit of a break, and he'd go down pretending he had been injured. And if anybody came near him, he'd say, poisson mort, meaning dead fish. And that was the signal, yes, that was the signal to say, I'm okay, I'm just giving you guys a rest.
Now, perhaps not surprisingly, we are sad to report Gilles Greton eventually had a nervous breakdown, right? What happened there?
In Toronto with the Toros, Billy Harris had been his coach. Greton responded really well. I think he was always looking for that father figure. Gus Bodnar had been that in Oshawa. Billy Harris was that in Toronto. And when Billy Harris was let go by the club and had to leave the club actually because his wife was dealing with his daughter was dealing with a medical issue. Greton felt like the bottom had fallen out from under him, and he felt that he was unable to cope without Billy Harris there. And he had a Porsche, he had this great contract, he had all this money, but he could not summon any happiness. And he felt just this, as you said, a nervous breakdown.
Well, let's stay with hockey for this next story here. The entry draft, we should explain, is something where the young junior players or university or college age players are drafted by the NHL teams to replenish their rosters. And it's a very big deal nowadays. They have it in hockey arenas and people buy tickets and they go and they cheer for their teams when they get good players and so on. In 1974, the Buffalo Sabres, with their 11th round pick, chose a guy named Taro Suzuki from the Tokyo Katanas. Tell me about Taro Suzuki.
Well, to begin with, he was fictional. He wasn't real. The Tokyo Katanas were fictional. If anybody had checked, which nobody did at the time, they would have seen that there was a Japanese hockey league and it existed for a long time, but there was no team in Tokyo. There was no team called the Tokyo Katanas. It all came about because Punch Imlach, who was the GM of the Sabres at the time, and his director of communications, Paul Wieland, were sitting there bored because the draft was done in kind of a secret to prevent the WHA teams from finding out who the teams were drafting. There were no conference calls at the time. So Clarence Campbell would have to phone each team.
The commissioner?
Yes.
President back then?
Yes, that's right. And he'd call them and tell them who every team had drafted since the last pick was made. And he had this lawyerly drone. And so Imlach and Wieland were bored out of their trees. I think Wieland said to Imlach, or Imlach said to Wieland, what if we drafted somebody that nobody would ever think of drafting? What if we took somebody that was totally off the board? And Wieland said, what if we draft somebody that doesn't exist? And Wieland had gone
to mess them up, eh?
Yes. Wieland had gone to St. Bonaventure University from Buffalo and back and forth, and he passed this stand, this farm fruit stand every time he would go back and forth. And it was the Tsujimoto Farm. So that was the name of the player he was going to use. And for a lot of this story, I consulted with Ben Tsujimoto, who was the great-grandson, I believe, of the original owners of that farm. And he's a writer for the Buffalo News now. And he was great. He would, anytime I have a question for him, he would get back to me right away, and we would have these wonderful conversations online about his family and how he knew the story as well.
Well, how long did it take for anybody to figure out that this guy was fictitious and didn't really exist?
Once training camp the following year, 74, 75, was about to begin, the Sabres made a stall with Tsujimoto's name on it, with a jersey with his name on the back, and they had to come clean. And when Clarence Campbell found out, he was livid. He did not like this kind of tomfoolery in his little backyard. Yeah. And that's what the NHL was back then. It was like a little backyard, but compared to what it is today. But yeah, he was incensed. And if you look in the NHL guide and record book up to a certain date, it goes through the drafts. And in 1974, it's got Taro Tsujimoto's name up to a certain year, and then it was expunged because he
doesn't exist.
Exactly.
Okay, here's another hockey story. It's 1982. Walter Gretzky, father of Wayne, obviously, drives from Brantford to Ottawa to pick up one of his best friends to fly to Helsinki because they want to watch Wayne play in his only World Championship tournament overseas. Pick up the story.
One of Walter Gretzky's best friends was Charles Henry. Charlie Henry, for those who don't know, was the man who became the general manager of the Hull Olympics once Wayne bought that team in the Quebec Major Junior League. Mr. Henry lived not far from where I live in Ottawa, was a firefighter, but also a hockey coach for the East Ottawa Voyageurs when I was in high school. His kids, the Henry kids, the Mooney kids, the Millette kids, all of us went to high school together. Michael Henry told me this story shortly after Wayne's father, Walter, passed away a couple of years ago. Walter drove from Brantford to Ottawa to pick up Mr. Henry. Mr. Henry didn't know that Walter was coming. He was in the middle of a 24-hour shift at his fire hall. Wally comes over and says, Charlie, we got to go. We got to go to Helsinki. Wayne's playing in the World Championships. It was the only time Wayne played in the World Championships. And Mr. Henry says, Wally, I can't go like this. I'm in the middle of a 24-hour shift. Walter says, it's okay. I've talked to everybody here. They're all going to cover for you. We got to go. And Mr. Henry says, I can't just do this. I can't just up and leave like this, Wally. It's not right. He says, your wife packed the bag. It's in the car. We got to get to the airport now. We got to go. Mr. Henry saying, no, no, no. Walter's saying, yes, yes, yes. Let's go, let's go, let's go. Eventually, Mr. Henry relents. They get on a plane to go to Helsinki. It's a 10-hour flight. They get there. They get to the arena. The people at the door don't know who these people are. Neither Mr. Henry nor Walter has credentials, tickets, papers, anything that says they can get into the arena. And these guys at the door are having none of it. So Walter pulls Mr. Henry aside and says, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to jump the turnstile. I'm going to go that way. When they chase me, you jump the turnstile, go that way. We'll meet at the bench. So you've got these two grown men running through the arena, running through the concourses of the arena, being chased by security people. They're attracting attention to themselves. They get down to the top of the stairs. They're going down the stairs. People are turning and looking. Mark Messier is on the bench. He looks and sees who it is. And he jumps up. He grabs Mr. Henry. He grabs Walter Gretzky, pulls them onto the bench, and he turns to the security people and says, no, they're with us. And so the mischievous Walter Gretzky wins again.
Not to be tried at home. It's one thing for the great one's dad to do it, but don't you try this at home.
And I think it was different in 1982 compared to now,
I suspect. Well, okay, let's finish up with a couple of baseball stories here. And for this first one, we want to go back 15 years. The Blue Jays at the time have a light-hitting shortstop named John McDonald. You can imagine what his nickname was. Prime Minister, right? Of course, his name's John McDonald. He was best known for his glove, and he had a great glove. We got an example of this right here. Sheldon, you want to roll this clip? Here's John McDonald playing short for the Jays.
Backhanded by McDonald, and from the seat of his pants throws him out. How do you like that? John McDonald.
Now, that's a fabulous play.
Unbelievable.
That is just a great play. This guy, John McDonald, might hit one home run a year. That was about it. He was not a power hitter. But he did something on Father's Day that those of us who remember it will never forget. Pick it up.
June of 2010, he gets word that his father had been suffering with cancer and he was starting to slip. So John leaves and goes home to be with his father. And his father says to him when John's sitting there, and he says, John, hit your next home run for me. And John says, Dad, I'm not a home run hitter. They're hard to hit. I think he ended up with 34 home runs or 31 home runs or something through his entire career.
His whole career, yes.
So his dad says, hit your next home run for me. So his father passes away. John gives the eulogy at the funeral and comes back to Toronto. Gets back here on a Friday night. His teammates welcome him with open arms. Sean Markham and he were best friends, and what they did was his dad was an umpire and wore number 25 when he was umpiring, so they got him a jersey, a Blue Jays jersey with number 25 on the back. They all signed it, gave it to him just to let him know, hey, we're all with you. Francis night, he's not in the lineup. Saturday afternoon, he's not in the lineup. Sunday, it's a series-ending game against San Francisco.
And Sunday is?
Father's Day.
Father's Day.
He's not in the lineup, but in the ninth inning, he gets to pinch hit. And they're losing, I think it was 7-1 at the time. And lo and behold, he tags one, and it goes over the left field wall, and he gets a home run. He's running around the bases, and just gets to the dugout. And I mean, we've all seen the footage of him sitting in the dugout, and he breaks down and runs into the tunnel because he doesn't want anyone to see him crying. After the game, I mean, the Jays lose, but after the game, everybody goes to John McDonald's stall. And one of the reporters says, what were you thinking of when you were rounding the bases? And this part always gets to me. He says, I won't be able to call my dad after the game. And that's the story. And it's tremendously sad, but it's one of those wonderful things that we all get goosebumps when we think about it or when we saw it. But to do the research and to read about it, or read about it before I wrote about it, it was one of those things that just took my heart and tore it apart. When I was doing my editing, when I was going through this chapter, I'd always start tearing up.
Okay, one more story here, and this is also baseball, and all of our stories are basically made in Ontario stories so far. I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative here to make one exception, because this next story happened in Fenway Park, Boston. It's 1982. the Hall of Famer Jim Rice is playing left field for the Red Sox, and something which I don't think had ever happened before and certainly has not happened since, something incredible happens. What?
There was a man in New Hampshire who was given 3 tickets. And he had 2 little boys, 3 tickets for a Red Sox game. On a Saturday afternoon, it was on the Game of the Week on NBC. They're sitting right next to the dugout. It turned out I think it was the Yankees' seats.
They're the owners of the Red Sox at the time.
Yes. I'm going by memory here, so it's, they were all thrilled to be so close, And about the 4th inning, a screaming foul ball line drive comes, and the father thought the ball hit the side of the dugout because it sounded like it hit cement, but it hit his son's head.
And this is in the days before they put the netting up to protect everybody.
Long before. Jim Rice had been standing at the top of the stairs. He came up and looked and saw the little boy just bleeding and thinking he may be in danger. Seeing where the boy was, seeing that access by emergency personnel was probably very difficult, he scooped the boy up. And he saw Dr. Pappas, who was the team doctor, at the far end of the dugout. They nodded to each other, and Jim Rice carried him into the medical room behind the Red Sox clubhouse. Arthur Pappas did what he could at that time to relieve any pressure on the boy's brain, and did what he could until a medical team, an ambulance could arrive and take him to the hospital. The hospital wasn't far from Fenway. And in that part of town, if you've been in that part of town, but it's very, very tight in terms of streets and everything like that. But Dr. Pappas was able to keep the boy stable, keep the boy alive. They got him to hospital. But it was Jim Rice's quick thinking that saved the boy's life. And he went on to work in IT, and he's never forgotten the actions of Jim Rice, and to him, it was just something that he'll never forget. Jim Rice will never forget it either. And Jim Rice has said, of all the things I've ever done on the field, this was like the greatest thing I've ever done.
That's the main thing. Jim Rice is in the Hall of Fame because he was a great hitter,
Yes.
and good on defense as well, and he led his team to a World Series in 1975.
Spectacular ball player.
But he should be in the Hall of Fame for what he did that day because he saved a life on that day.
Just incredible, the quick thinking, the wonderful gesture, everything, the way it all happened. He and Dr. Pappas locking eyes across the dugout together, going back to the medical room, doing all of that, and saving the boy's life. It was something.
Howie, we've been talking about doing this interview for a very long time. We finally got you here. You have lots of stories about these and others called Crazy Days and Wild Nights in one book, The Consequences of Chance in another book, and more Crazy Days and Wild Nights in a third book, and keep going, keep writing. It's lots of fun.
You get the books on Amazon. The last books, Consequences of Chance, is 17 stories, 17 chapters. If you have Prime, it'll get to your house in a day and a half. It's that's the best way to do it.
Good stuff, Howie. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for everything.
How much do Canadians know about the history of Black liberation movements in this country? In his book, Cross-Border Cosmopolitans, The Making of a Pan-African North America, author Wendell Nace Ajete traces the history and influence of Pan-African thought across Canada, the U.S., and the Caribbean. He is also William Dawson Associate Professor at McGill University. His book won the Canadian Historical Association 2024 Best Scholarly Book in Canadian History. He is also the first Black historian to win the 2024 Governor General's History Award for Scholarly Research. Congratulations and welcome, Wendell. It's nice to have you in the studio.
Thank you so much, Sam. It's my pleasure to be here.
This book, it's very, very thick in detail, the amount of research that you must have gone through. Why were you drawn to this area of research?
Thank you. That's an excellent prompt because it reminds me of all the different hands that have shaped my trajectory as a little boy growing up in the city and sort of metropolitan Toronto and in Mississauga as well, and then going off to the United States to pursue doctoral studies. But specifically a lot of my African Canadian elders and mentors as well, who were of Caribbean extraction, continental African extraction, Nova Scotian or Canadian extraction, and then American extraction. And so these are men and women who have seen Canada evolve and change over the generations. And it was a process of getting bits and pieces from them at different stages of my life that basically kept pushing me towards a particular understanding of what the Canadian experience was. And lastly, I'll add that I had an amazing black professor, my only one at the University of Toronto as an undergraduate, named Dr. Sheldon Taylor, who taught African Canadian and Caribbean history. And in his course as a sophomore around like 2005, I mean, it literally set my mind ablaze in terms of the possibilities of history and Canadian history and African Canadian history, U.S. history as a tool of social change.
I love that, the possibilities, right? Because we want to instill in our kids and everybody that history is full of so much wonder. I wanted to start the conversation, though, by going over some terms. When you say Pan-African, what is it? And when you refer to Pan-Africanisms in the book, what does this include?
Indeed. So Pan-Africanism in the context of the Atlantic world, in the context of the last 500 years, so more or less the making and the rise of the Atlantic world. Pan-Africanism means the unity of African peoples, of black people. Unity for the purposes of establishing a free black soil or free black homeland, and principally that's the African continent. Pan-Africanism in this sort of early modern context was really crystallized and refined because of the experiences of transatlantic slavery, where Africans from mostly Atlantic Africa, who came together as a result of the Middle Passage, whether they were Fon, they were Yoruba, they were Gan, like my peoples, they were Asante, they were Fulani, sometimes Africans from around sort of Southern Africa and East Africa. But the process of transatlantic slavery brought them together so that instead of identifying principally with their ethno-cultural markers, they start to perceive themselves vis-a-vis Europeans or vis-a-vis white people as black. And so this is sort of the making of Pan-Africanism, and it would feel the resistance against transatlantic slavery. It would feel resistance against forms of anti-black subordination or subjugation. The inherent diversity and multicultural and sort of the various multiple ways of being a human and being black is understood within Pan-Africanism. And so it was actually not Africans on the continent, but Africans in whether they're in Brazil, Africans in Cuba, Africans in Saint-Domingue, which would become Haiti or Haiti, Africans in Jamaica, Africans in the Mississippi Delta, or Africans in Nova Scotia. As you know, our fellow compatriots identify as African Nova Scotians, not black Nova Scotians, right? And so it was this understanding that to be African is to be diverse, but in that diversity, there was a unity of purpose. And the purpose or objective or end game was that Africans or black people were working towards overcoming forms of white domination and anti-black racism.
And when we talk about cosmopolitan, what do we mean?
Excellent question. So cosmopolitan, regarding the African spirit, the founding father of African-American history named George Washington Williamson, a very noteworthy name. Incidentally, he was the first person who would alert the world of King Leopold's genocide in the Congo Basin, right, in the late 19th century, and the person who coined the term crimes against humanity, a black man from the United States. But George Washington Williams, in his foundational book on the African-American experience coming out of from bondage to freedom, noted that Africans, and I quote, Africans since antiquity have always been a cosmopolitan people. So there's this sort of basic general understanding and intuitive understanding that African peoples are very multilingual. I only speak one additional African language, unlike my mom and dad who speak multiple languages.
I know, it's a shame. My auntie speaks 9 languages.
And which is the norm.
Where it's normal. And when I came to Canada, I spoke 3 African languages.
Brilliant.
English is my 4th language.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant. And so I'm lacking on my African bona fides. But Washington was alluding to the fact that Africans understood the process of being local, both local and global. And this is cosmopolitanism in its purest form, that you can be local and you can be global at the same time. But this is also Pan-Africanism, that I can be in Montreal, I can be in Nova Scotia, Halifax or Preston, North Preston, but I can also be part of a global community.
It's not about the borders.
It's not about borders. In fact, to be African defies borders, and hence why the process of carving Africa up and the process, of course, of delineating Africans based on mostly a Westphalian understanding of nation states is injurious to the African personality and African self-determination.
I wanted to read a passage from the book that speaks directly to the idea of crossing borders. And in the book you write, in many instances, crossing borders was more than an economic decision. It was an act of solidarity, intimacy, and survival. Border crossing provided black men and women in North America with an exit strategy and release valve when the pressures of anti-black racism and disillusionment proved overwhelming at home. Knowing and understanding the racial landscape in North America became a matter of knowing and navigating an unwelcoming home. How did this idea of ideas and movements across borders happen?
The process of border crossing is in so many ways, as I note in the book, a process of survival. And so when we think about African peoples on the North American mainland, meaning, Canada, the United States, Mexico's included as well, and also the Caribbean basin, that the ways black people and black communities achieved a semblance of freedom was to move. And the process of moving meant you can reinvent yourself. The process of moving meant when things are bad here, you might seek greener pastures elsewhere. And so during slavery and the various forms of bondage and unfreedom to which black people were subjected, we noticed that whenever black people sought freedom, principally it was through their feet, right? To become fugitives, right? Or fugitives from slavery. So they would travel elsewhere, relocate, cross international boundaries, whether they're traveling south into Mexico or north into what was then Upper Canada, Lower Canada, or British North America, meaning Canada.
When you think about that journey, how terrifying it must have been, but I guess it must have been more terrifying to stay where you were as opposed to trying to cross a border.
Indeed, and we're talking about peoples who had very limited options. But the process of seeking to move and relocate was in so many ways a recurring theme of black freedom.
You have so many great stories in this book of so many figures that we don't really know about, and the contributions that they've given to Canadian history. And you start your book with someone called Juanita de Shield. Who was she, and why did you start the book with her?
Indeed. So Juanita de Shield, or Dr. de Shield, she obtained a doctorate and worked as a psychologist for many years before retiring. So she was an African Canadian in the Montreal community, from the Montreal community, born circa 1913, the first African Canadian woman graduate of McGill College. She was in her late teens, early 20s, and I'm being very serious, a leading anti-fascist activist. So imagine this young woman who's very much cosmopolitan in all the ways we think about cosmopolitanism, understanding the ways of the world, understanding the troubles of militarism, understanding the troubles of fascism, understanding the troubles of European imperialism. And she is relocating from her home base in Montreal City, very rooted in her community there, fully, conversant in English and French. She arrives in New York City in the 1930s. She's working to make ends meet, but she's reinvents herself as a writer at the same time that she is critiquing the world powers. And I use Dr. de Shield, our late elder and ancestor, Dr. de Shield, to illustrate the ways that ordinary black women and men are thinking about some of the most seismic, disruptive forces of the day, well before we would see sort of Nazi Germany and its allies try to take over Europe and the world, but that, black people, black women are critiquing these ideas, and this speaks of particular ethic because she was inculcated in a Garveyite household, a household that believed in Pan-Africanism, Marcus Mosiah Garvey, indeed, and that Africans and black people should work together, notwithstanding borders, and Dr. DeShield is very much a product of that world.
And also, too, from the other people that you write about in the book, she kind of had that sensitivity to injustice, as you write about somebody else, Roosevelt Douglas, and the audacious way that he actually ended up in Canada by just calling up the Prime Minister?
Literally.
Can you tell us his story?
Indeed. So Roosevelt Douglas was born on the island of Dominica in the Eastern Caribbean. He had applied to attend undergraduate studies in Canada in the early 1960s. And Douglas, like some Caribbean students, African Caribbean students at the time, was unsuccessful in obtaining a visa to enter Canada. And so he, being very audacious and literally not thinking that he was bound by anything or anyone, picked up the phone and asked the international operator for Prime Minister Diefenbaker's office. Dief's secretary answered the phone and passed the message to Diefenbaker.
But he called back.
And Dief called back and made sure that this young student was able to get his visa and enter Canada. And him and Dief established a lifelong friendship until Douglas's activism became a little discomforting for Diefenbaker because Diefenbaker was a progressive conservative.
Yeah. Which is interesting because I think it leads us into the next conversation, which is this paradox. Because Diefenbaker understood that injustice, as you wrote of.
Yes.
But then when it was, I guess, when it started feeling a little bit too uncomfortable, that relationship changed.
Yes.
I want to read another passage from the book that goes into that a little bit. You write, the Canadian public had an insatiable appetite for sensational news of U.S. racism. It fueled the paradox of progress, which made Canadians feel exonerated of their record on racism. Race, in fact, influenced the identity that Canadians wanted to project to a post-war world. Race also shaped Canadians' perceptions of the United States as society that they believed lacked the virtues of British civility concerning the treatment of black people. This was so fascinating because I think when Canadians were looking to the state, and maybe kind of similar to what's happening right now in present news, saying that Canadians are much better than Americans. So can you elaborate on this paradox of progress in Canada?
Indeed. And so I would say one of the main factors that helped me distill this idea of a paradox of progress was certainly having grown up in Canada, but also living in the United States for 7 years over the course of my doctoral training, and being in sort of the heartland of the empire, right? And understanding U.S. society, not from without, but from within. And understanding the ways that Canadians and Canadian society and Canadian institutions are able to accrue moral authority vis-a-vis the United States, how the United States is in some ways hamstrung because of its own shortcomings at home and overseas. So it allowed me to sort of structure this notion of a paradox of progress, that if you look at two entities that are maybe two vehicles, right, that are in neutral on a flat surface, but in car A, the motorist is gently tapping on the accelerator, meaning the vehicle is going to be moving backwards, slowly, gently tapping. And in car B, the motorist sits there, but does not tap on the accelerator. Within a matter of seconds, minutes, and even an hour or so, invariably, you'll see a major chasm between car A and B, even though they start off roughly at the same place as settler colonial societies. But we will see the United States as being so much more regressive and Canada as being so much more progressive. And this is the paradox of progress, that Canada really truly never had to do much because Canada has this, through the blessing or the curse of geography, Canada is affixed at the hip to the United States. The United States, as we know, with its gory images of lynchings and just redemptive violence, especially where black peoples are concerned, and sometimes indigenous peoples and other groups. The U.S. and as an empire looks that much more foreboding, whereas Canada appears more civil. Canada appears tamer. Canada appears circumspect and sometimes even more introspective. Mm-hmm. And so the paradox of progress is that by virtue of our proximity to a really problematic society, Canada simply looks better. And that, in so many ways, obfuscates the forms of anti-black racism in Canada, anti-Asian racism, anti-Jewish racism, and absolutely anti-indigenous racism. That all these forces are very much present in Canada, but the spectacle of violence and dispossession and hate are so much more profound in the United States, and so therefore we think that Canada is just inherently virtuous.
You have an example of a gentleman by the name of Jimmy Wilson,
yes.
And I won't spoil it for people to read the book,
sure.
But I think that really demonstrates this paradox of progress. You've mentioned, we've talked a little bit about how Canadians, we seem to have like a rosy picture of our history, especially when we do compare it to the United States. But there's a lot that the book goes into that kind of says that's actually not accurate or factual. So can you tell us a little bit about what happened at Sir George William University in Montreal?
Sure. So Concordia University, which was formerly known as Sir George Williams University, in the 1960s, and my friend and colleague David Austin has written about this in a very thorough way. But in the 1960s, Montreal in so many ways was like the melting ground of sorts of various activists and radical thinkers and intellectuals, and many black people from the Caribbean, homegrown black people from Canada, black people from the United States as well as the African continent, attended university in Montreal, organized in Montreal. And because of this coming together of all these forces, and including forms of Quebecois nationalism as well, homegrown nationalism as well, Montreal became a radical site of activism. And so at Sir George Williams University, given the influx of black students in the city, which was very frightening to a lot of residents of the city and sort of the ruling class, some black students, 6 of whom in fact had identified that their biology professor, they alleged that he had marked them in a racist manner, was consistently giving them bad grades. And so this issue of students protesting unfair treatment generated sort of a broader movement of sorts, because there was so much anti-black racism in the society, in the city, in the province, in the country at large, in this sort of decolonizing moment, that it triggered a student protest and an occupation in January 1969, which was infiltrated by members of law enforcement, especially at the RCMP Federal Police. And this infiltration of this student peaceful, law-abiding protest turned into a riot of sorts, sort of a violent protest. But it was because agent provocateurs had instigated a conflict among the students, and an unknown assailant had set a fire, which triggered this massive disruption. And so this incident in 1969 would really destabilize Canadian society in terms of how members of the ruling class, politicians, business elites, the security apparatus perceived that black people and black people's presence posed an existential threat to the Dominion, to Canada.
Is that when Rosie's and Diefenbaker's relationship changed, or is that?
Yes, yeah. That was in fact sort of the watershed moment where Diefenbaker had, in so many ways, and I think this is the proper verb, had been grooming Roosevelt Douglas to become the first black MP in the country, and he would have ran in a riding in Nova Scotia, in Halifax. And Roosevelt Douglas had all the skills and the charm and charisma to pursue that objective and to carry the flag of the Progressive Conservatives. And he was like a card-carrying member. Mm-hmm. But at this particular moment, Douglas understood that his elder, his mentor, his political patron, didn't fully understand the issues that black people experience in this country. And I must say, for the record, as a historian who believes in the power of nuance and balance, Diefenbaker, although he still doesn't receive his due, is probably literally probably one of the most effective and greatest prime ministers in this country in terms of understanding what he did to improve the rights of black people, to defend the interests of Japanese Canadians, and certainly of indigenous peoples. But he doesn't get that sort of credit because he is seen as being conservative.
Yeah, he pushed back on a lot of those policies.
Indeed.
We have about 5 minutes left.
Sure.
But some of the book read like scenes from Jason Bourne, because I was like, what? That's incredible. Your stories about the CIA.
Yes.
You also had some shocking details in the book about the RCMP collaborating on counterinsurgency with the FBI.
Indeed.
Can you tell us more about this cross-border intelligence system? Why was this happening?
Indeed. So coming out of the 1950s and the 1960s with the civil rights movement or the freedom struggle in the United States, and the ways that there was cross-pollination between that and what was happening in Canada, but also with connections in the Caribbean and the African continent as a time when African peoples are resisting the forces of imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, militarism, you name it. And so in around 1956, the FBI, the federal police in the United States, and not just the FBI, but sort of the broader national security apparatus in the U.S., created this initiative called the Counterintelligence Program. But its main objective, I mean, it had multiple objectives. I mean, it went after women's groups, radical women's groups, and various leftists, white groups, indigenous peoples, black people, etc., communists. But its main objective was to neutralize, and when I say neutralize, I mean basically to decapitate militant black movement in the United States, what they call black nationalism. So think of an archetype like Fred Hampton, who was assassinated by the FBI and Chicago police, or Malcolm X, etc. The objective of COINTELPRO was to disrupt black organizing in the United States, and also disrupt connections elsewhere, overseas. And so given Canada's national security apparatus's own anxieties about black people who were not taking up arms against the Canadian government or Canadian institutions, black people were simply marching, protesting, resisting that we don't want to live in a racist society. We want the rights afforded to all Canadians. This created a great deal of anxiety, a great deal of paranoia that was unbeknownst to even the Prime Minister, who was Pierre Elliott Trudeau at the time. The Minister of the Solicitor General, who oversaw the RCMP, he didn't know at the time, but the brass within the security service coordinated with the FBI, with their counterparts, through the Department of External Relations and Department of State, to bring an African-American FBI operative to Canada because they couldn't find a black person to betray the community here, to infiltrate black community spaces, to provide and specifically to inculcate black boys who were of teenage years, inculcate them with, criminality and a penchant for gang violence, as opposed to them engaging in constructive forms of community organizing and civil rights protests and human rights protests. And so the objective for the FBI, the objective for the RCMP at that time, was to sow as much doubt and distrust in the minds of ordinary Canadians, meaning white Canadians, that black people are violent, that black people, when they say they want civil rights and human rights, they actually want to take up arms against the Canadian state, and that black people will work with the indigenous nations to pursue this objective. And that was all patently false. This was part of the counterintelligence, and literally that is what counterintelligence is. And it was part, as I argue in the book, a process of counterinsurgency, a form of low-level warfare against black communities. And it happened right here in this city. It happened in Montreal. It happened in Halifax. It happened in various indigenous nations across the country. And one of the sort of last objectives was to sow as much distrust between indigenous nations and black communities, because there was a coming together of sorts. And indigenous nations drew a lot of inspiration from black power. In fact, they named their protest movement in the 60s Red Power. to pay homage. And so, indeed, the connections with the CIA, with the FBI, with international gun running, all types of things that we would never guess about Canadian history, and the connections to U.S. history, Caribbean history, African history.
I mean, my reading the book, my jaw was on the ground because that was obviously very effective, because I think a lot of that distrust still exists today.
Yes.
As Canadians, why is there so much that we don't know about our own history? We have about a minute left.
Sure. Part of the reason is because it's taken a while for Canadians of very diverse backgrounds to penetrate the historical profession, which is like a guild in and of itself. And so the reason why I ended up becoming a historian, partly because, I have a father with a 7th grade education, but a masterful storyteller. And I had a black professor as an undergraduate at the University of Toronto, Dr. Taylor, whom I mentioned, who taught me the power of history, and history and sort of the professional writing of history. There were many roadblocks that would have prevented me from being able to become a historian, to write a history like this that would give our society and our country different sensibilities in terms of who we are and from whence we came and where we might be able to go in terms of understanding and reconciling our sort of difficult past. So I think the more diverse the profession becomes, the more history will invariably get from really fascinating vantage points of the Canadian experience.
Because even in the book, you're right that at one point, Jewish people were the only ones that would rent to black people.
That's correct, yeah.
This book is incredible. You're an incredible, gifted storyteller and historian.
Thank you.
And I just want to give you like 5 seconds to say thank you to your parents, because I know that it's very important
Thank
for
you. Thank you so much. So many thanks to my father, Soa, my mother, Nankrabia, to my beloved kinsmen, kinswomen on the African continent, to my peoples at Atrikowe, and all freedom-loving, justice-seeking peoples everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been an incredible conversation. Thank you so much, Wendell, and congratulations on everything.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, December 18th, 2024. Tomorrow, it's our annual music show featuring some of the province's best talent. Tune in to find out who. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.